Our first two episodes, we talked about technique with hands, with rolls, and so this third episode I wanted to break from the norm and talk a little bit about percussion notation and technique of reading percussion music. This is something that each year my students come across with their marching show, or maybe it's region auditions, or in the spring we have our solo and ensemble contests, and there's always something that will be a little tricky rhythmically in music, percussion music especially. And no matter what stage you are in your career, you could be a secondary student, you could be a college student, you could be a professional playing, there will always be something, always find tricky rhythms and rhythms that are difficult to play. If you've ever heard the phrase, if you give someone a fish, they eat for a day, and you teach someone how to fish, they eat for a lifetime. And that's true with a lot of things in life. And reading percussion notation is actually one of those things. It applies to reading percussion music. So someone may be fortunate enough to have a teacher or an instructor come in and help them with a particular rhythm that they're having trouble with. And they'll be able to figure the rhythm out and say, okay, here's how to play it. Okay, and they go on to the next challenge. Some students may not have that advantage. But either way, it sounds like that instructor may be just giving them a fish. And so they eat for the day. So empowering yourself and learning how to count these rhythms and figure these rhythms out, you're actually teaching yourself how to fish, and therefore you can carry that into the future and decipher any other rhythms you come across. Seriously, this technique, or the techniques I'm going to show you about counting and figuring out rhythms, will help in any situation. I'm able to do that myself now, and I want to help you to be able to do that as well. And soon enough, your friends in school will be coming to you asking for advice and help on how to count their rhythms in their assigned parts. I've had many teachers in my career that have enabled me and taught me how to fish, so I'm able to read and figure out a lot of difficult rhythms now on my own, and then therefore I can take that skill and apply that and help my students and teach my students how to do the same. It really comes down to a mathematical concept. Music is math, as much as I hate to say it. And if you are not keen on math, like I am not keen on math, math is part of life, and it's music is one of those things it's mathematical. When you're learning the music, when you're trying to understand these rhythms and how the rhythms are put together, it is mathematical. When I speak to my students and we sit down and we figure out how to count these rhythms, a lot of times I'll start at the basics, and sometimes they're missing something in those foundational basics that will help them apply that skill to reading other rhythms down the road, either a week from now or a year from now, so on and so on. So I want to make sure all their basics are covered. It's like a foundation, so if the foundation is not strong, of course everything you build on top of that will not be strong either. We start with 4/4 time with the note values of whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes. And we start at that very, very basic level because we want to make sure that that foundation is, again, very strong, so we can build upon that foundation. There are lots of different ways that we can practice to understand these rhythms. We could take, let's say, whole notes, half notes, and quarter notes. We can create several measures worth of different rhythms. We can count out the rhythms. We can write the counts above each of the notes in the measures. We can clap the rhythms, so on and so on. So there's a lot of different ways to understand how to decipher and how to understand these rhythms. You want to be as comfortable as possible with all types of rhythms and with all types of notes. Eventually, yes, we add on the eighth notes and the 16th notes, and we mix them all together. And speaking of just notes, we add the rests as well. The note values for each of the notes and rests. An eighth note and an eighth rest, a 16th note and a 16th rest, for example. Eventually, when they're very comfortable at that point, we work on some odd meter rhythms using odd meter notes and rests. So triplets, for example, we could use eighth note triplets, quarter note triplets, 16th note triplets, and we can create rhythms out of just triplets and rests. We can eventually create rhythms out of the triplets, the odd meter type notes and rests, and then the even meter stuff as well. So we mix it all together, and those create some really tricky and crazy rhythms. But the more practice they have, and the more that they are comfortable with doing this, the better they'll get at learning to count and understand these rhythms. And this work that I do with my students is also something that you can do as well. So this episode, as well as the next episode or two, will look into the foundation of notes and rests, starting with the basics. We'll get into a little bit more complex stuff. And the goal, again, is to empower you to be able to read these rhythms and understand these rhythms, so you can take that knowledge and apply it to everything you have in front of you right now and in the future. The remainder of this episode will cover, like I mentioned earlier, whole notes, half notes, quarters, eighths, sixteenths, and rests as well. We'll start by looking at the note tree and how the note tree breaks down each note and each note's value and how each note is related to each other in value. A whole note gets all 4 beats. So if one measure contains 4 beats in 4/4 time, you'll have 4 beats in one measure. That whole note will start on count 1 and it'll end on count 1 of the next measure. So in other words, a whole note gets all that space between count 1 and count 2, and then count 2 to count 3, count 3 to 4, and finally from count 4 to count 1 of the next measure. If you take a whole note and you cut it in half, you have a half note. And a half note is just half the length of a whole note. So it starts on count 1 of the measure, it goes all the way to count 3 of that same measure. So we start on count 1 and all the way to count 2, and from count 2 all the way to count 3, and we end on count 3. So we get all the space between count 1 and we end on count 3. A quarter note gets 1 count and ends on the next count. So for example, if we put a quarter note on beat number 1, count number 1, it's going to go all the way to count number 2 and stop. If we put another quarter note right on count 2, it starts on count 2, ends on count 3. Then the third quarter note is going to start on count 3, end on count 4, and our fourth and final quarter note starts on count 4 and it ends on count 1. So notice they start on the beat and it takes up all that space in between count 1 and 2. The next one starts on 2, it owns all the space between 2 and 3. Next one starts on 3, goes all the way to count 4. The last one from 4 all the way to count 1. So there's 4 quarter notes in the measure. And this is starting to kind of make a pattern and reminds me of a dollar bill. If you think of a whole note, the whole note is like $1, 100 cents basically, right? A half note is like a 50-cent piece, and you may or may not have seen a 50-cent piece in your lifetime. They're out there. They're not very common, but they're out there. A 50-cent piece, so of course if you take 2 50-cent pieces, that equals 100 cents. That equals $1. If you take a quarter, well, that equals a quarter, 25 cents. You put 4 quarters together, you have 100 cents. You have $1. So we're seeing that each of these equal each other, or 4 quarters equal the dollar. 2 50-cent pieces equal the dollar. We're seeing how they're all related. Eighth notes are where we start to divide up a little bit more now. So we're dividing a quarter note in half, and then we're taking the eighth note and starting on beat 1, and now we're not quite making it to beat 2, right? We're cutting the quarter note in half, so we're going to land in the middle of beat 1 and beat 2. We start on beat 1, so we're going to stop halfway to beat 2. So what do we call that? So that's where we add some syllables into the mix as well. So if before our beats or our downbeats are called 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, so on and so on, now we have to have a name for the eighth notes. So the eighth note, it can start on count 1, it can start on count 2, count 3, count 4, so on. But if there are eighth notes in the middle, let's say the eighth note starts in the middle of 1 and 2. That syllable, I've heard different things, but I have grown up and learned the and syllable. It sounds like the word and, but it looks like the little N sign. So when I start a measure, let's say it starts on an eighth note, count 1, it goes all the way to the and of 1, right in between 1 and 2. So starts on count 1, ends on the and of 1. I can put another eighth note on the and of 1, and it goes all the way to count 2 and ends on count 2. So that one starts on the and of 1, ends on 2. My next eighth note starts on 2, ends on and of 2. Next eighth note starts on the and of 2, goes to count 3. It ends on count 3, so on and so on. So when I put all these eighth notes together into one measure full of eighth notes, it sounds like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So I'm saying the and syllable in between my numbers. But notice if I make all of those eighth notes back to back like we did, that will equal the same amount of time as one full whole note, is one whole note. So that equals all 4 beats. So I need 8 eighth notes to equal one whole note. The 16th note now is a division of an eighth note, so we're getting even smaller. So a 16th note is half of an eighth note. So notice as we're going down, we cut in half, cut in half, cut in half. Everything gets cut in half. The 16th note is half of an eighth note, so it feels like we're going to a microscopic level. But if an eighth note, let's say we start right on count 1, it's going to go to the and of 1. And it hasn't made it to 2 yet. It's on the and of 1. So from count 1 to the and of 1. So a 16th note, let's say we start a 16th note on count 1. Now it's going to end halfway between 1 and the and of 1. And it's going to end on a new syllable in between 1 and the and of 1. And those syllables, that's where it starts to sound kind of silly, but it's probably the best syllable I can think of, which is also the syllable system that I have learned when I learned to read music way back in the day. And these syllables are E and so literally a letter E and then a letter So when I count 4 16th notes in a row, starting on count 1 and then ending on count 2, the first 16th note starts on 1, ends on E. The next one starts on E and ends on and. The third 16th note starts on and, ends on and the fourth 16th note starts on and ends on 2. So when we put those together, we have 1 E and my next 16th note would start on count 2, and so on and so on. So 4 16th notes start on each of those syllables, 1 E and Then I can put 4 more 16th notes on the next full count, 2 E and I can do the same thing with 3 E and I can do the same thing on count 4, my last 4 16th, 4 E and So when I put all of those 16th notes together, and eventually I have 16 16th notes that take up all the space of that measure. So now I have 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and then it stops where? On the 1 of the next measure, right? Because the of 4 sounds 4 E and I'm going to put a 16th note there. That's going to start on the of 4 and end on the downbeat or the count 1 of the next measure. Whew. That's a lot of notes. It's a lot of counting. But it feels like there's a lot to take in, and maybe it is if you're new to reading rhythms or you're new to reading music. But when you see it, and for me, like me, I'm a very visual learner. So if you see this and you're able to say it and you can see it in front of you, it makes a lot more sense. And you understand like, oh, I'm just doing half of this, or this is just half of this, and so on and so on. There are some links that I will leave down below this video, and these are going to be links to a couple of worksheets. I know it sounds like we're in school. You have homework. These are worksheets I want you to do. If you need these worksheets, or if you know someone that can benefit from these worksheets, please take a look at that link down below and download those. You can print them out, or if you have a tablet, you can just fill them out with your favorite app. And these will really help and reinforce what we were talking about in the lesson today. In the next episode, we'll go to the next level and look at some a little bit more difficult rhythms, and we'll look at some tied notes in some of the rhythms as well. And if we can, we'll add in some of those odd meter notes and rests that I mentioned earlier, some of the triplets. I hope that I can help you understand rhythms if you're having trouble doing so, and especially in the next few episodes where we get a little bit more complex, you can understand these just as easily as you've understood what we're talking about today. And if so, I'm extremely happy to do so. And I look forward to the next episodes. And I hope that you'll continue watching and subscribe. And please tell friends about the series if you know someone that also can benefit from this video series. So thank you again for watching, and we'll see you for the next episode.